Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. I am so grateful you are here with me today for this important topic that we're going to cover. And I cannot wait to introduce you to my guest today. Without further ado, let me jump in and let you know a little bit about her. Amelia Kriss is a drama therapist and certified coach in private practice in the Bay Area, California, where she lives with her husband and two powerhouse daughters. She works primarily with recovering people pleasers and nice girls who are ready to deconstruct self-defeating patterns and find more ease and joy. Amelia is also deeply committed to birth story medicine work, helping birthing parents integrate and move forward from unresolved issues connected to the experience of giving birth. Yes, we don't talk about that very much. She believes that supporting parents through birthing as a rite of passage is an important and often missing piece of creating healthier and happier families. Welcome to the podcast, Amelia.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I am thrilled you're here. Your bio, I was like, oh my gosh, we could go talk about perfectionism, people pleasing, the birthing process, postpartum.
So much.
When we got on before we got started, you're like, this all ties together, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it does. I mean, so when I started my career as a therapist, and it's been, I guess, almost 10 years now, which feels crazy, I was really drawn to working with women, but also all sorts of people around like, what are these stories that we have about ourselves and these standards that we're holding ourselves to that intellectually we know are impossible and that we don't hold other people to generally, but that we sort of make ourselves miserable with. And have been doing that work in lots of different ways. And then I guess it was 7 years ago now, I had my first child. And I had this huge like personal awakening, which I don't think is uncommon, but it was new for me. And all my perfectionism stuff and all my like over researching and overextending and like everything's so high stakes, like was so loud. And as I got my own sort of healing off of that, I sort of started bringing that back into my clinical work and also in my coaching work with folks. And just really wanting moms and all parents to know, like, we can't do this perfectly. And the sooner we let that go, the better we can actually do it and the better it feels. So that's kind of the center of all of it for me.
It is such an important conversation to be had because we do have these standards and these stories of how we should be as a woman, how we should be as a partner, how we should be as a mother.
Yes.
So tell me about your awakening that you had the birth of your first daughter.
So all of us who've been through this period know that it's like very fuzzy, right? So I'm going to tell you what I remember about it, but I was in such a sort of altered state in early postpartum, and I think most of us are, that I'm kind of reaching into it and telling you from a place that's much more grounded now, of course. But I think the core of it, I have this really clear memory. My daughter Vera was just a couple days old. And we'd had some visitors and some people, and everyone had been like sweet and kind. And it was like that kind of cocoon postpartum. And I remember my husband like looked at me and really asked me, he was like, how are you? And what I heard come out of my mouth was, I feel like I just got back from a war and everyone else is acting normal. I want to be clear that my birth experience, I'm not comparing it to a literal war, but that was the emotional tenor of it to me, is I felt like I had been through something that I had no place to put it. And no time or space really to process it. And then I like had this tiny person that I was like, I'm going to take care of you. You have a lot of needs. And so I think when I heard myself say that to my husband, I had this my therapist brain went, okay, let's not forget that. Seems irrelevant. So I think that was the beginning of me being like, something has happened to me on an identity level that I did not expect. And for all the childbirth classes and all the reading and all the like good student did leading up to the birth, I realized I was like, oh, I understood maybe what labor was going to be like or might be like, but I had no understanding of what was going to happen inside of me. In what way was I also being born?
Yes, that's what when you were talking, I was like, this is the birth. It just hit me. The birthing
Totally.
process is the birth of the authentic
Like
you.
parents are being born in that moment too.
Yes.
Right. And I think
Yes.
that's the thing that often gets lost in the conversation about it. So I'll try to tie this to like in my work with clients now. I often am like, oh, that's the missing piece, is because we're not framing it like, hey, this is a huge experience. However it goes, whatever the details are, this is a threshold that you come back from changed. That's what it means to give birth. Because we don't have that framing, or a lot of folks don't, I think there's a lot of self-blame and shame about specific things in the labor or birthing experience. Like people personalize it. They're like, oh, I guess I should have done this right. And then maybe if I hadn't said yes to that intervention, then this wouldn't have happened. And it's like, wait, let's pan the camera back. This is a huge, intense experience. There's no controlling it. There's no getting it right. That's it. Like if parents had a sense that like, that's what this is, rather than there's some right way to do it, I think there's a lot of suffering and like particular birth and medical trauma that would not be so intense for people.
I agree. I'm wondering, this may be a deep question.
That's okay. I'm game.
So I'm going to tie this together because we have our own birthing stories. As what we
Right.
were once a baby, we were in our mother's utero.
Totally.
How much do you think there is a subconscious connection to our own birth process? And then we're now giving birth. There seems to be, is there a tie-in there between the two?
I think there must be. It's a thing. I mean, I would be interested in whatever research has been done. It's a thing I think that would be very hard to study, right? Because we're talking about like the absolute beginning of preverbal memory. Although maybe there are things that we preverbally remember from in the womb. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a really interesting question. But I do think there is whether we call it that, like a connection to our own being born experience as babies, I do think there's a collective consciousness around it. I think there's I don't know, but certainly the birthing parents that I've spoken to, they talk about this birth, the labor land, and all these ways that we describe this kind of liminal space between the baby being here and not. I think we all have a sense of how primal and how universal that is when we're in it. And there's something to that. I think there's something really beautiful there. But I think if we're not prepared for how intense it is or can be, that can feel scary. When really, I think maybe there's a way that we get to contextualize, like, it's not a coincidence that you, at some point in labor, go back to like older parts of your brain.
The body remembers.
Right. When we talk about like our animal selves, they know how to do this. But if we're not prepared for what parts of ourselves might come forward in the birthing process, I think we can be afraid of things that we don't need to be afraid of.
It's very interesting because we think about somaticism. For those listening, it's your body. We know through research, through Dr. Basil van der Kolk's research and others. I mean, he's one of the pioneers that wrote The Body Keeps the Score. We absolutely know that the body holds all the memory, even from utero. Our bodies feel and sense, even if we don't have what we call explicit memory, we have more of an implicit memory, which we call the subconscious. Here we are. Most women do not talk about their birthing process. They don't process it because, like you said, now we have to take care of the baby. Now I have to shift from my own experience and processing it to take care of the baby. And can we do both? And can we start normalizing a conversation around how was it for you? Tell me about what the birthing process was like in a real vulnerable sense.
Absolutely.
And we're supposed to be happy. We're supposed to be grateful. We're supposed to meet all these needs.
You're so right. That's, I think, part of it. And I think this is where it connects to all of sort of perfectionism and patriarchy and these stories about how women, and particularly mothers, right? Whatever that role brings up for us, whatever stories we have about how we're supposed to embody that, a lot of feelings or experiences are like not allowed. And that, I think, is part of what makes us sick, right? To the extent that we struggle and suffer, I think a lot of it is this gap between how we think we should feel or how we think we should present and the dimensionality of what's actually going on. And I think that's a huge thing that happens postpartum. And even as you're talking about like inquiring about birth stories, it's so tricky. I think I can't tell you how many pregnant folks I've spoken to who just while they're pregnant, it's like they get on the bus and someone wants to like tell them their traumatic birth story. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think part of that is because it's so unprocessed for so many of us that we have these like compulsive stories that we tell, which like, that's what a trauma story is, right? Is I don't know what I'm telling you because I haven't processed it. And then I'm just like, here, hold all this. And you are just like pregnant on the bus on your way to work, like, no, thank you. That is like, without villainizing anyone in that interaction, I think that's a symptom of the fact that as a society, we don't have safe, conscious spaces to talk about what happens for parents.
That is such a good point, because if you're already scared about maybe your loss, something bad happening, because
Totally.
we have that fear inside,
Of
that
course.
anxiety inside, and then we're hearing someone else's birth story, which is really a trauma story,
Yeah.
unprocessed, and they haven't had the opportunity to tell anybody. That is such a highlight point. Can you share more about how that, if you're already afraid, what does that do to the nervous system?
Right. Well, I think that's one of the things that's really, really, I'm so glad you're asking this, because I think there is this really polarized conversation around both pregnancy and birth. And it leaves really no room for the middle ground. And that's where most of us are. So I'll try to tell you more about what I mean. But like, if you think about strong birth messages or opinions, we hear a lot from the one side of the spectrum that's like, this is like a medically necessary crisis and you're in danger, and so is your baby until we decide you're not, and good luck with your project. Totally, so much fear. Then on the other side, there's this sort of message from, I don't want to say natural birth, because I think all birth is natural. So I want to just reclaim that phrase. But from the other side, there's this messaging that if you're enlightened or pure enough, you can have this like blissful, even orgasmic experience, right? And I'm not saying that either one of those isn't true for some people. I'm saying for most people, we feel some amount of fear, normal, and some amount of trust in our bodies and ourselves and the process and the lineage of millions of years of birthing people. I think it's both. And so I think often we end up in these conversations where what's actually battling is this ideology between whether it's a be afraid experience or a trust yourself experience. And there's no room for like, most of us feel both. It is scary. It is uncertain. And we have coping mechanisms and skills and thousands of years of collective experience and wisdom to draw on, both, not one or the other. And one or the other puts us in a bad spot, I think.
So share about the shame stories in postpartum. And a shame story of, I'm not doing it good enough. I'm defective.
Yeah,
I'm a bad mother.
totally.
I'm a bad
It's so
person.
painful. Yeah.
We're bumping up against, am I good or am I bad?
Right. And am I doing it right or am I doing it
Am I doing
wrong?
Which goes into, am I good or bad? So if I'm doing it
Totally.
right, then I'm a good mother. If I'm
Right.
doing it
Whew.
wrong, I'm a bad mother.
Absolutely.
And I'm causing harm to my child and I'm damaging them for life, which isn't true. We can always rewire networks, neural pathways. There is always healing. We can always do repair work. But talk to me about that.
Yeah, I think that's so big too. So I think often because there's this setup going into birth, people make birth plans, right? Which I think just implies that there's some way that you can control this or do it right. No, what you can control is how you show up. What do you know about yourself? What do you know about what makes you feel supported and held? What do you know about what you're not into? That's a birth plan to me, is knowing myself and entering into the situation in a way that hopefully supports my best coping, my best compassion for myself and others, right? Anyway, that's another rant. But I think what happens is people make a birth plan and they think it's a report card, right? At the end, I'm going to fill out if I met this rubric or not. And the truth is, we don't get to control what happens. That's the only thing we know for sure, is it's going to unfold how it's going to unfold. And hopefully we get to take that as it comes with as much grace as we can. And I think what, to your point, what happens is I think the message gets in so deep that like, this is your first important job as a parent. You're going to be birthing right. And then when whatever their expectations are about what right means don't get met, that was the first thing I did as a parent. And I messed it up. I failed. I couldn't even do that. And I don't think these are super conscious thoughts. I think they're what kind of gets baked in underneath. And often when I'm working with people in birth story medicine and in processing, what comes out almost every time is it's not literally what happened in the birth. Sometimes there are incredibly scary and traumatic things that happen in birth, but most of the time, core of it is something in their mind went wrong. Something didn't go the way they thought it should, or they didn't make the right choice in the moment, or they didn't advocate enough, or their partner didn't advocate enough, or this provider didn't understand, or whatever. And the pain comes from what they make that mean about themselves. They start telling the story, if I wasn't so weak, I would have asked for this. They start telling the story, whatever it is. And it's like, that's the story that hurts them moving forward. that I believe gets in the way of them getting to really be with their kids, which is what our kids need. They don't need us to be perfect. They need us to regulate enough that we can be present. And whatever's in the way of that, it has to go. You don't need it. They don't need it. It's not even true.
So when you're talking, I'll share a story about my birthing process with my oldest. And this is where there's a lot of deep rumbling. What you said, what you want, what works for you, what won't work for you. And I knew from enough that my nervous system could handle and not handle certain people. It was going to take me out of the process. I was going to have to caretake them, i.e. my mother. And some people love their mother in there, and that's very regulating to them.
Probably it's so individual.
It's so individual. Yeah, so I want to make sure I'm clear on this. But for me personally, I knew I will have to see her after. After the birthing process is done, I will see her after. I'll just have my husband in there, and that will help me stay regulated. And then I'll see her afterwards. So here she comes right in the middle, peeking her head. And we had told her the boundaries. This is boundary. We will see you afterwards. We're very loving.
She's like, does a peek count am I still holding the boundary?
She was trying to do it so nonchalantly, like I'm hiding behind here. And I got her heart and desire to be there as a mother. I understand. You want to be there for your child. You want to see your grandchild born. That makes sense to me. And how hard that was for her to process, but she really had trouble handling that boundary. And I could feel the difference of seeing her peek around. And therefore, having the ability to say, and my husband to help, because I'm birthing in the process of birth.
You're a little bit busy, a little bit
busy. Having that support and having the plan ahead of time, it didn't go according to plan because we hadn't predicted that she would try to come through. And knowing what was good for my nervous system and what was good for my mental health and emotional health was so important and is so important, not only with the birthing process, but in life. So that's an example of even the people around you affecting your ability to self-regulate, your ability to center and keep as calm as you can. Absolutely. Is so important in this journey of life, whether it's birthing or any other event or thing going on in your life.
Absolutely. And I think one of the points you're making that's so important here too, and it's a great example that it's your mom, because we're talking about you birthing, but also your experience being a kid and her being your mom, right? And just that sometimes the love that we need, the care that we need, it doesn't look like the way they might want it to. Sometimes the care that we need is, I'll see you after. And then having them, as painful as it may be, regulate that's not the way they wanted to show the care, but the way to care is to honor what you asked for. And I think that's a huge lesson for all of us with our little ones too. It's like, I have this story about how you're supposed to be born so that I can think I'm a good mom, but really this is going to unfold how it unfolds. And I'm going to make room for what that is and try to love you and me both through it. And so that's maybe not going to be pretty, but I'm going to try.
And I'm going to work on self-soothing enough to accept and meet you where you are and not take it personally like I'm a bad mother.
Right.
Or you don't love me, or you don't want me, or I'm not important enough. All those shame stories, that's not our job to manage for someone else. It's our job to kind of be aware of those and start tending to those, exploring them with curiosity and compassion and nurturing them. I'm really curious. Tell us more about birth story medicine.
Okay, so I'm going to try to keep it brief because this is where I get very nerdy. So birth story medicine is a methodology that was developed by Pam England, who's a midwife. She's written some books. Her work is really incredible. And then I have another teacher in that program. Her name is Denitzer Omag. So I've learned a lot from both of them. And then I also think it's important to say, and then I'll say more about it, is that this idea of birth story medicine, or basically stories or narrative as medicine, is ancient, right? And certainly it doesn't belong to my most recent teachers, right? It is an ancient healing, I think, impulse in human beings. And there are traditions of it across the world. So I think I was drawn to it because my original training is in drama therapy, is in using theater and acting techniques therapeutically. And now I'm in private practice and I do some of that in very small ways, but not in super performance oriented ways most of the time now. It's a one session modality, which is also incredible to me because I've been doing processing work with people for years around birth stories. And basically it's this very structured, but also flexible time that I spend with birthing parents. And they come to the session knowing there's something about the birth that they need to process. They may not know exactly what it is, and that's fine. We'll find it, but they know that's what we're there to do.
And this is giving birth, they're giving birth to not their birth story, but
not there as the baby, but them as the birther.
And as the mother birthing.
Yes. And basically what I think is really revolutionary about this method is it's a way of looking at the story and sort of unpacking it that is very different than the way we would normally tell our birth stories. Like you've probably told your birth story, you've probably heard friends and other people tell their birth story. And usually that version is a very medical version. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And that's a true version of the story. But there's also a whole inner dialogue about that's happening in the moment that we may or may not be aware of in the moment. Certainly in the later stages of labor, we definitely aren't. But it's helping people to separate in a way what happened from what they're making it mean.
Wow. So separation of what actually happened to the meaning they've assigned to it.
Right. And so it's not my job to decide what meaning is right or wrong. And I'm not over here saying like, that's not the meaning, but put a little bit of space between what happened and what we've decided it means about you. Because that space, we can't change what happened. The birth has already happened. That's not changing. What can change is what we're holding about it, the residue that we've decided to carry forward.
Okay, so let me see if I'm getting this in a deeper way to translate this into perfectionism. Okay, so you said the meaning we assign to it, is that the birthplace of perfectionism?
I think that's a really good question. I think there's definitely something there because, yeah, I think perfectionism is a lot about the meaning that we assign. It's a lot about like, okay, I've decided that if I can do this way, then that'll be perfect. And all of that, as you're saying, is our own sort of invention. Perfect doesn't exist in an objective way. It's whatever our stories are. So I think that's right. I think that's one of the things that's so powerful about narrative exploration and narrative therapy across the board is that it is a type of mindfulness. It forces us to back up and go, okay, but not all of this is what happened. Some of this is all my imagination on top of that. Some of this is my story that person didn't like me. And my story that if I'd done this, that, or the other, if my partner had done that it would have gone differently. And those are things that we don't get to know. We don't get to go back and see, is that true? Can we test it? It's like the truth of these things is shaky to start with, and they're not serving us. So what if something else is possible?
Okay, now here's another question in terms of I love this conversation. So
me too.
We're telling our birth story. We're trying to find the meaning. Here's what happened, and here's the meaning we've kind of assigned to it. Yeah. How much does that play into postpartum depression?
Yeah, so I think that's a really, really important piece of this. So there's lots of research that tells us very clearly that an experience of birth trauma is a risk factor for lots of postpartum issues, including postpartum depression. And if we think about the trauma is rooted both in what happened and in the story we told about it. And so if we can soften that a little bit or bring some more questions or possibilities to that, then we're able to hopefully, there's some breadth around the story and hopefully, I think the goal for all of us at some point is to be able to just get to a place of acceptance about not just our birth experiences, whatever they were, but there are so many things that we go through that we don't get to go back and do it again. That's how it went. And what does it mean to be able to grieve some of what we wish it had been? Maybe to be angry about whatever it is we need to be angry about. And also to go, okay, what healing do I need to move forward in my life without the shadow of this or with less of it?
It's so powerful for people to go, there is possibility and hope when you are going through a birthing trauma, postpartum depression. And we know hormones, there's so many variables. Totally. And we know if we're holding the space to process the body responses to everything, the emotions, the meaning we're assigning to it, the shame stories, getting the hormones regulated, all those things, we're able to move towards acceptance.
And I think, and this is part of the work that I do with people a lot. And I think in some ways it's sort of a kind of sideways or backwards approach, but it tends to work is like, I'm always trying to help people grow their capacity for self-compassion. But sometimes people are like, I don't know what that means. I hear you saying, be nice to myself. Well, like, I don't know what that means. And sometimes I'm like, you know what? Forget talking to yourself nicely. I mean, we're going to come back to that. But I'm like, let's just, especially postpartum when people are so tired and so tapped, let's just go to the body. What does it mean to treat yourself, your body, like someone you love and care about? That's it. And you can fake it. You don't have to mean it, but I want you to do it. The way we bathe our babies, massage our babies, hold our babies, the depth of our understanding, and we don't have to be therapists to know this, it's so deep in us, the understanding that their bodies need us, and that their bodies need to be held, loved, regulated, fed, nurtured, rested. I'm like, just do as much of that for yourself as you can. And you don't even have to mean it, but do it. Because I think there's a way that we begin to learn kind of from the outside in too. Let's just practice being kinder to ourselves and see what happens. You don't have to get it. You don't have to study it. Let's just take the first step. If your baby needed a hug, you would give your baby a hug. It's not rocket science. It's hard, but it's simple.
What I just came up with when you were talking is this visualization. And I've had clients do this where if you're rocking your baby or you're on a glider, you're rocking yourself. Like you are rocking yourself that feels exhausted. Maybe you feel like you're failing, you're not good enough. And maybe you're just like, I'm barely making it, holding on by a thread, and I'm about to lose my mind.
Yes.
Just get in the rocking chair. You can hold the baby or not. You can just rock yourself, because what that does is it tends to the nervous system and calms your body down. And it's a way to be kind, to your point, to yourself. It's a way to take care of yourself. Totally. I highly recommend people invest in a swing, or like outside swing or hammock or some sort of a rocking device, especially postpartum. You can do it anytime, but especially postpartum.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of, this is, I think, ties back to your question earlier about like, are we aware of our own birth, right? Are we subconsciously connecting to our own baby selves? And certainly in postpartum, we are. Certainly. And that part of us, and it's also so beginner's mind, especially with your first child, but also every child is your first, that child. But you're in this place where you really are at the very beginning of learning this relationship, this person, this role. We're babies too, in that sense. And it just, I think we deserve so much more care, not just from others and from society, but from ourselves.
Yes. And I think this is a good point, because I shouldn't say we, I know I and many women struggle with asking for help. I should all over ourselves, that people have heard that expression, but I should be able to make the meals and take care of the kids, or I should be able to do it all, work. And the reality is we are not meant to do that. So asking for help is very vulnerable, whether it's your partner, whether it's a friend, a neighbor. It's so hard. So what do you say to women when they're like, I don't want to ask for help, or that's way too vulnerable, way too uncomfortable?
Totally. I'm so glad you're asking that. So I think there's even a step before that. Before we get to the asking for help, we have to recognize what our even nervous system alarm systems are. And to your point about being like socialized as women, and I think it happens across genders in lots of different ways, many of us are so disconnected from our own capacity, from our own limits, from our own bodies in that sense, that it's like ask for help is almost like we don't even understand. It's like, what? And I think that's part of the training, is to start with, okay, how am I doing? Okay, my heart is pounding. That's interesting information, right? I can't tell you how many, and I don't think it's just postpartum, but it happens in all kinds of moments. I can't tell you how many people I talk to who are like, do you ever just get in that zone and like you don't eat, you don't pee, and like the end of your workday comes and you're like, oh my God, I gotta pee, I gotta eat. And it's like, that's what I mean, is being just floating totally above your actual physiological experience, which I think is something that women are taught to do in all kinds of ways. And then you become a mom. And then it's like, there really is this little being it's not their fault, but they constantly interrupt your self-connection, and you constantly override your own need to attend to that. And so I think that's the first thing, is like learning how to drop back down and be like, oh yeah, you're here. You're having an experience. What's that about? And then when we can start to practice like noticing how we're actually doing before it's like a rage scream, right? Often it's like the first symptom, I snapped, right? And it's like, wow, there was a lot of signals before that we didn't hear. No shame, but what is it like to maybe start listening a little more deeply? And then I think we can go, okay, this is where, all right, when I start having this, I'm going to make this up. But like when my hands start sweating, for instance, maybe that means it's time for me to go to my partner and go, I'm going to take 10 minutes. I'm also not going to micromanage or assign what you do in that 10 minutes. I'm leaving. Just starting to be able to hear ourselves, because I think the idea of asking for help doesn't even occur to us when we're not actually inhabiting this space.
So true. We're not even connected.
Who? I don't even have it. There's nobody to help here. I'm a robot. It's like, that's what we have to get underneath, I think.
And if you've played the parentified child, which means you took on the responsibility of being the responsible one in the family system, you help caretake emotionally your parents in some way, or a parent or a sibling. Yeah. And now you're just functioning from that role of parentified child. Totally. Don't recognize it because it's your normal.
Totally.
So that's something you're talking about too. Like you're just used to taking care of everything. You're used to being the one to have it all together. And when you feel like you're not, and you feel like I'm losing it, I feel inside, that's very grief producing and scary and anxiety producing.
Oh my gosh. It's so destabilizing because when you think about the parentified child is a great example, you think about that's a survival strategy. That's a role that you take on because that's what you need to survive in your family environment. Often no one's doing that to you on purpose. Like again, it's not about blaming or judging any of that. It just happens. And then fast forward, let's say sometimes it's a new child, but there's all kinds of leveling up in our lives that make it so we can't do it all, right? The over functioning kind of just like backfires, right? There's something gets messed up in the system and we can't actually do that anymore. And it's so important. I do this in my work with people all the time. It's like, it makes total sense that you're afraid of that because your child self couldn't let that happen. The only way through was to be in that role. And whether that was true or not, that's what it felt like. And so I think for a lot of folks who think of themselves as like high functioning, high achieving, like got it together, right? Often parenthood is one of the first frontiers that they're like, oh, snap, I can't do it all. This is not possible. And again, then all these first feelings come up, right? What if that's your first experience thinking, oh my gosh, I can't juggle all of this. I can't do all of this. What's going to happen? Like, it's never felt more high stakes and it doesn't feel possible. And that, although it's so scary for people, that's the doorway to choosing something else. Like that's the opportunity to go, okay, what if I don't carry everything? And is the sky actually falling? And wow, okay, what if I let people around me help? And if the information is they can't help me, then that's important information too. But we're never going to find out if we are constantly holding ourselves to this standard that is not just impossible and like ludicrous, but also really damaging for us.
It can be where you feel broken open, that awaken. And you're like that awakening process where you're awakening to what you really need, what you really want, and your body's screaming at you. It's saying, I can't. And it has been for a long time. This just happened to be the catalyst to really awaken something in you that's been knocking at the door for a long time.
Totally. I mean, I think that's another thing that we talk about somatics a lot, where it's like there are so many whispers that our body will give us, so many whispers and nudges before it gets loud, before something goes wrong, and many of us are just not listening. And also we live in a world that teaches us not to listen, right? Like, I mean, there's nothing about capitalism that's like, hey, tune in, take a minute. We have to do that work ourselves. And I think it is, at least for me, being with both of my babies and having that like mandatory slowdown has been a great teacher about my own nervous system and about my own capacity. Even though there have been moments where it has been incredibly frustrating or hard, and I have wanted to push myself through or push them through or whatever I think my grand plan is. But there's something really beautiful about that breaking open and about letting some stuff fall and having the body level experience of, oh, I'm okay.
Because I feel like our children are here and other people, our partners, our friendships are here to awaken us, to mirror back something in us that is just wanting to expand, be released. I remember when I had my second daughter and they're 18 months apart. And I thought, what have I done? Because I know from being a therapist, they have all these needs. And we have what's called secure attachment. That means mom is attuned emotionally, physically. We have to be regulated to help regulate our children. All these variables that I know are important. And I remember thinking, I've got two of them. And how am I going to do two? And it was a real reckoning for me on reckoning with my own shame, not feeling good enough as a mother, because I felt like, oh, I'm going to mess them up and they're going to have insecure attachment or anxious attachment. And I want them to feel secure in who they are. In order to do that, I've got to be consistent with meeting their needs. And it was so much pressure. It was like, I got to be this perfect mom, which we know doesn't exist.
Oh my gosh, so exhausting. And what you're making me think about, which is sort of my safe place as a mom and as a therapist, and certainly in the postpartum time, I kept telling myself about like Winnicott's theory about the good enough mother. I kept being like, listen, You're going to attune the best you can. You're not always going to be able to attune. And that's what makes them resilient enough to deal with the actual world. Good job. I was like, I'm going to take that and run with it because as you're saying, right, on as far as the attachment and sort of the ways that our training can get the best of us, the way we know just enough to like terrorize ourselves, our kids, we're not going to be able to totally attune. That's good for them. I'm going to do the best I can. It's not going to be perfect. That's good for them. You're welcome.
It's real. It's serious because Winnicott is one of the researchers who really pioneered the attachment work with John Bowlby.
I was like, you're not going to be okay in the real world if I literally attune to every need and I can't. So that's perfect.
We're setting it up. That'll work out just fine. So for those listening and they want some practical, helpful strategies, steps, what would you say to them?
About what particular piece?
About healing their birth story so that we could take that piece and then perfectionism maybe as piece two. And maybe they tie together.
Totally. I think so. Certainly, as far as healing the birth story goes, or any huge experience like that, I think getting some professional help and partnership and support is always a plan. It doesn't have to be me. There's many of us out there. But I think finding a place, whether it's therapy or otherwise, where you can really, really dig into what the story is for you without having to feel like you have to take care of the other person, without having to feel like they have judgments or their own stories in the way, which often we have like wonderful friends, but they can't really hold that space in the same way often. So that's number one, is it's okay to get support, even if you're not in crisis. In fact, support is for all the time. Support is for hopefully so that we don't have to get to crisis. So that's my soapbox about that. And then the other piece that I think is really, really important is really thinking about what were your expectations or ideas or dreams about what the experience would be like, and where did the experience itself in your mind, because that's all that matters, fall short of that? And is there a way for you to let yourself feel sad or disappointed or wish it had gone differently without blaming yourself for that? Because I think often part of the way that shame, I think, works is some of that is kind of self-protective, right? Like if we can say it was my fault, then there's this story that maybe we could do it differently next time, or maybe we could avoid that pain in some other context. And I think often the truth is it's not your fault, which means you can't control it next time either, which means we have to actually get into the deep work, the grief and the sadness, that we don't get to control everything that happens. And when we can get down to that, and actually, I mean, for any of us who've been through grief processes about anything, there's a way to move through it. There's no like Band-Aid, but there is a way to carry it where it doesn't feel so heavy and we're not so mean to ourselves. And I think that's the hope. That's what we get.
That's beautiful. What would you say about perfectionism?
You made it up. I made it up my version too, but like there's so many things, but I think this is the core of it. I think, at least for me, my experience of perfectionism is it's rooted in the fact that I want to be loved and accepted by other people and by myself. But what happens when I pretend that I'm perfect as opposed to I'm me is the love and acceptance that I get doesn't even get to me because I feel loved and accepted for what I'm performing, which is like I'm perfect and I have it all together and all this. The real love and acceptance, the belonging that all of us want, is only possible if we let people see us. It's not coming from perfectionism. That is not a recipe for the thing that we long for. And it's really hard to remember that because I think that we mistake being like admired or envied or whatever sometimes for being loved and accepted. And it's not the same thing.
I love this conversation.
Me too.
I'm so grateful for you, Amelia. If folks want to find out more about you and your work, where can they find you?
So you can go to my website, which is ameliakriss.com. I assume it'll be in the show notes. You can see it there.
Kriss.
Yes, ameliakriss.com. I also have a newsletter there. I have a newsletter for pregnant folks called Soft Cheese. It's basically, I created it to be kind of a companion for the pregnancy journey. And it's like love letters and permission slips and resources and things that I write every week that I like love doing. And yeah, it's just a place to hopefully hold like all the absurd parts and all the sacred parts and just all of it.
How did you come up with the newsletter title, Soft Cheese? Now you got me intrigued.
It's funny. That was the thing that I wanted to eat when I was pregnant that was like iffy, not allowed. And then I was like, actually, softness and like cheesiness is very on brand for me. Like I can provide that. I can promise that.
I'm a cheese ball.
Yeah. And I was like, I just want it to be, it's sort of about like holding it a little more lightly, but also being able to really talk about a lot of it is about hopefully preparing to show up for the birth experience, right? Not planning how it goes, but going like, okay, how do you deal with fear? What's your relationship to pain? What kind of support helps you? Like practical sort of know thyself explorations so that hopefully people feel it's such a weird thing, birth. It's like I say all the time, it's like you have power and you get to make choices, but you don't have control. And the more we can just lean into our own agency and whatever choices are available in the moment and let go of the idea that we can control it, I think the better off we are.
Yes, control is an illusion, and it's hard to wrap our minds around that.
Absolutely. And I think you're naming something that is actually central in a lot of people's birth experiences, depending on how their life has gone up to that point. It is often the first real, face to face with the reality that that's an illusion. And that is a huge shift for a lot of people and not one that they're psyched about.
Because they're like, I did everything by the book. Like you said,
Yeah.
I did the checklist. I did everything by the book. It was supposed to go this way.
Totally.
And the grief and the shock. I mean, you're really going through the grieving process and the shock of that.
Absolutely. The shock is so real. And I think that's why I do this birth story medicine work, which I love. And then what it has kind of led to in me is this, like, what's the preventative medicine? What can I do with people so they never have to come to me to process their birth experience, right? I love that work. And also that's kind of what the newsletter and sort of some of the new stuff that I'm working on is there a way to prepare for this as a kind of, in sort of the lineage of birth story medicine, right? As a kind of heroic journey, as something that's going to be challenging, that's going to bring you to the edges of yourself. And that's a part of it. It doesn't mean anything about you.
Know thyself. It is the most empowering work you'll do and the best investment in yourself. Know thyself. That's where boundaries come from.
All of
That's
it.
where permission slips and self-compassion and empathy and attunement, like all the things come from that place, working through those shame stories. So thank you, Amelia, so much. I loved our time together.
Me too.
It was a joy. And I know this will be helpful to so many people. So please go check her website out. And thank you for your heart, your energy, and your time.
Oh my gosh. Thank you too. It's been wonderful.
Till next time. Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, BOICE.com. Thanks and have a great day.